Is this future, bro? Is this past? Do you know who I am? I am the arm. And I sound like this. You are in. Now there is no place to go. Home.
Heads up, this essay explores how nostalgia functions as a source of dread, particularly in horror games and media, and it touches on sensitive topics like loneliness, trauma, memory, and abuse. Nostalgia is scary. Look, it can be comforting, yes, but there is almost always another presence within the feeling. You're comfortable, and yet something's not right. You don't know what, but there's something other here. In a recent video I made about Minecraft nostalgia, I described how I experience nostalgia. I said, it's like being told I'm in the safest place I possibly could be, in my family living room, playing a video game on the TV. And yet, I'm not able to shake the feeling that if I turn my head, there's gonna be something behind me. Modern video games seem to understand that. Modern horror games in particular embrace it, harness it. It seems like more and more developers are taking this idea, the understanding that without fear there is no comfort, and thus nostalgia finds itself somewhere between, and running with it, creating atmospheric, quiet unease out of the things we as players deem comfortable. It's funny, if you look at the modern horror landscape within gaming, it is so clearly being dominated right now by either remakes of older titles or new original titles designed to play or look like a product of a time long gone. When I think of some of the more important titles that use nostalgia in this space, I think of things like Five Nights at Freddy's, a concept that went on to spawn a massively successful medium-hopping franchise, yet was so fundamentally reliant on the childhood fear of animatronics and mascots that so many of us encountered when we were small. There is comfort in its setting. These are the retro Chuck E. Cheese style diners and arcades that you might have once upon a time had a birthday party in. And yet it uses that to turn your childhood fears into a nightmarish reality. I think about Paratopic and its unapologetically PS1 era style. It feels like you're playing an older title that's since corrupted, like you're living a corrupted memory. More recently, World of Horror released a game heavily inspired by the works of Junji Ito and H.P. Lovecraft. It used MS Paint in designing its art, making it feel like both the experiences of playing an old school RPG and reading horror comics you're way too young for combined. Why is it that these games seem so hellbent on evoking nostalgia, and how is it working? Before we answer that question, let me tell you about our partner, Instant Gaming. If you like the look of any of the games you see in today's video, you'll be able to get them at significantly reduced prices with Instant Gaming. On Instant Gaming, you can buy your digital games across all platforms with up to 90% off. I use them myself, and delivery is super quick. I get my codes instantly as soon as I've paid for them. And with 24/7 customer support, I know I'm in safe hands. And I can save more money, buy more games for significantly less than elsewhere. They have everything from older titles to brand new releases and even pre-orders. So save yourself some money and support the channel by shopping on Instant Gaming at the link in the description. In Tim Wildschut's 2006 study into what causes nostalgia, it was found that participants in the study who scored higher than average on a scale of loneliness also scored higher ratings of nostalgia, suggesting some sort of causal relationship between the two. More specifically, and I quote, "High loneliness increased significantly the ratings of the following items: my family, the way people were, having someone to depend on, and not having to worry." Meaning that loneliness seems to further increase nostalgia towards the ideas of family and safety specifically. I think of this study often when I think about games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Paratopic. In both of those games, you spend a lot of time completely alone. In Paratopic, it's the moments of walking or driving, seemingly aimlessly, and alone with your thoughts. In Five Nights at Freddy's, it's the nature of your being. You are alone in front of a monitor observing. Of course, as it turns out, you are not quite literally alone, but still. Outside of the horror genre, there are also a number of other video games that seem to understand this concept, that loneliness increases nostalgia towards the ideas of family and safety, and that there is a level of unease when you combine the two. I'm thinking of Firewatch, a game that is not a horror game, and yet one that had me checking my doors and windows were locked while I was playing it. You are mostly alone. Outside of a voice on the other side of your radio, and in sections where you venture from your post, investigating trails and the like, you'll hear a twig snap. And the reminder of your physical loneliness tightens your chest. It sickens your stomach. Quickly, you assume there is danger nearby. You long for safety to return. You want to go home. I want to talk about something other than a video game for a moment. I want to tell you about a movie that fundamentally changed me as a person, a movie that made me feel a way no other movie has. Indulge me for a moment, I'm going somewhere, I promise. I'm talking about Kyle Edward Ball's 2022 film Skinamarink. The film is, on both a sonic and visual level, unfriendly for its audience. Originally stemming from a lack of budget, Ball refuses to show the audience anything that is happening on screen point blank. Instead, shooting the walls, ceilings, and corners of the rooms his characters find themselves in, asking the audience to use the minimal context clues they're being given to work out what's going on. I set rules in place that I wasn't allowed to break. We never see someone's face, we avoid showing people on screen for too long. Whatever dialogue is delivered is always delivered off-screen. I developed a technique of filming by implication instead of showing. So instead of showing actors, I was doing point-of-view shots or filming different parts of the room while we had audio off-screen. Outside of Ball's use of filming by implication, he also commits to making Skinamarink feel like an old VHS. There's fuzzy, extreme levels of film grain and cracks and pops in the audio. The film, by all accounts, is presented with nostalgia in mind. I bring this up because one of Skinamarink's main themes is that of loneliness. The main character is a child, trapped at home alone without his parents for comfort. Tim Wildschut's study, the one that I have argued for to this point, is far from perfect. The study's participants were mostly college-age British women, and so we can't exactly say for certain that its findings can be generalised, because this sample of participants is so specific that it's not representative of all groups. For example, using only participants of college age doesn't account for the fact that there logically could also be a relationship between age and nostalgia. The feeling of yearning for times of the past is probably likely to increase in those who've lived longer and therefore have more times to yearn for. Wildschut himself also later looked at nostalgia's potential as a resource. In his 2011 study, he found that the present research provides evidence that nostalgia is a psychological resource that can be harnessed to derive and sustain a sense of meaning in life. Meaning that nostalgia could actually be used positively as a means of therapy in order to return a sense of meaning to those suffering an existential crisis. These findings personally resonate with my experience with Minecraft for me. I won't go any further here, you can find more words on that in the video linked in the description. To top off this idea that nostalgia can be used as a positive force, Zhou found evidence to suggest nostalgia could actually have a positive impact on loneliness specifically. Her 2008 study tested the possibility of nostalgia counteracting reductions in the perception of social support as a result of loneliness, finding that while loneliness decreases perceptions of social support and increases nostalgia, nostalgia itself actually increases perceptions of social support. Thinking about it, I've been in that position many times in my life. I'm lonely, but I'm so lonely that I can't actually motivate myself to go outside and interact with others. But nostalgia brings about memories of family and friendship in a way that promotes being social, proving that it has restorative value when it comes to counteracting loneliness. But With these studies in mind, if nostalgia is such a positive force, actually helping to counteract loneliness and existentialism, how is it so effective still as a means of scaring us, within both video games and even skimmering? Well, it seems reasonable to me to suggest that filming by implication within the medium of film is quite similar to utilising low poly graphics such as those of Paratopic. Audiences of both are asked to use their imagination to fill the gaps of visual ambiguity that both possess. That visual ambiguity, the gaps that need to be filled, is reminiscent of one thing to me, and I've touched on it slightly already: memory. Earlier, I called Paratopic a corrupted memory. I meant it. These low-poly PS1 style graphics that modern horror indies love to utilise, as well as Skinamarink refusal to ever show the audience what's going on directly, feel like you're seeing those little hyper-specific details of a memory. For example, when I was very young, I went to hospital to have a lump removed from my eye. I vaguely remember being scared and there being a lot of noise, but it's all kind of a blur. What isn't, though, is that I remember how the metal bar on the side of the bed felt when they were pushing me into the operating room. The rest of the details are fuzzy and scary, but that metal bar, is a hyper-specific detail I have never forgotten. I can try and search the memory, figure out what the voices were saying or what the rest of the memory looked like, but in the end, none of it will ever feel as definitively real as that one detail. The metal bar. Anything outside of that metal bar is doomed to mystery. It could be true, or it could be a misrepresentation of the truth. I can never know. Ambiguity. Now, we've talked about Skinamarink, and we've talked about many types of horror games, mainly those that use retro art styles, but what we haven't talked about is really the elephant in the room, if the room in question is modern horror video games. I'm talking about liminality. The liminal space phenomenon isn't one exclusive to gaming. You could even suggest it influenced a lot of the shot choices within Skinamarink. It was born from a creepypasta, but as with all popular creepypastas, eventually the backrooms and the liminal space phenomenon it spawned made an impact on the indie game scene. I'm thinking of games like Exit 8, Pools, Control. That was a little earlier, but hell, you could even argue the point for Paratopic itself. Liminal spaces are notoriously a little difficult to define in a way that everyone agrees with. There's a common consensus that these spaces are transitional, hallways, waiting areas, and that the offness of them comes directly from the feeling of being in between places, stages, and even sometimes time. For me, I would agree that there is something inherently transitional about most of them, but I also think it's worth mentioning that there's almost always a mundanity to them. It's never a picture of what it's like to go down a water slide, but instead it's the area you wait to go down it, or the pool it spits you out in. It's the boring bits. There's also something else about them, perhaps most important to this video. They're lonely. These are all places people should be, and yet they're not. They're absent of life, devoid of soul. Your mind can't help but feel unsafe. Where did all the people go? What's at the end of this hallway? Why does it feel so off? Dread. Ambiguity. Have you ever recalled a dream where you've wandered areas often populated by life and yet in the dream they were lifeless? Or maybe you've dreamt of people but they were faceless, off. That's my personal hypothesis for why liminal spaces are so effective and filled to the brim with dread. They're dreamlike. I'm fully aware I'm not the first to say this, but again, dreams, nightmares, memory, it's all important here. In 2017, Stephanie Reck studied nightmares, focusing in particular on trying to identify any causal factors. It's a fascinating question. What causes nightmares? Reck found that both nightmare occurrence and severity were associated with higher levels of worry, depersonalization, hallucinatory experiences, and paranoia. Although the exact causal relationship is up for debate, do nightmares cause worry, depersonalization, hallucinatory experiences, and paranoia, or is the reverse true? We can pretty definitively say that the study found clear evidence of a relationship of some form between these two. I find this study curiously intriguing in the case of modern horror. Depersonalization derealism disorder is described as the feeling of being separate, outside even, to yourself, and observing your life from a distance. This feeling of distanced observation is present in most of what we've mentioned thus far. The oblique filmmaking of Skinamarink, the low polygraphics of titles like Paratopic, the security cameras of Five Nights at Freddy's, the in-between state of liminal spaces, it's all in some form a way of distancing you, the player, the watcher, the audience, from the reality of the situation. Take Skinamarink, for example. A lot can be happening on screen, and yet the audience are never presented with it directly, forced to make things out from a distanced, separate perspective, be it shadows on a wall, blood on a carpet, or the consistently confusing distance of the film's dialogue. Paratopic is a similar story. Both the visual presentation and the structure of the narrative is unclear. The game purposefully distances you from the truth. In Five Nights at Freddy's, you are literally forced to judge the likelihood of your survival from a distance, watching over the security cameras and making judgments and taking precautions accordingly. Liminal spaces position you somewhere between the question and the answer, distancing you from both, leaving you with only feelings of familiarity and unease. This is only further emphasized by the fact that derealism can also make the people and things around a person seem lifeless and foggy. Lifeless and foggy. Liminality. Ambiguity, memory, dreams, nightmares, it's all either lifeless or foggy or both. Nostalgia. Much like Wildshut's 2006 study, Rex isn't perfect, and there are clear limitations again with generalization. 90% of the sample for Rex study were women, ignoring any potential gender-based cultural differences that could impact on the occurrence and severity of nightmares. Furthermore, participants in the study applied through an advertisement referring to it as a sleep survey about dreams and nightmares, so logically, it's likely that individuals with pre-existing sleeping issues applied because it would be of greater interest to them, and therefore those issues themselves could be misrepresenting the general population and skew the results. For example, you likely clicked on this video because of either an interest in video games or an interest in nostalgia. There's an incredibly low probability that if you're here, you have no interest in either. An important thing to note with depersonalization and derealization is that symptoms can sometimes be the result of a vestigial reaction to traumatic, life-threatening events. It's interesting then that the way so many of these games get under our skin is by reflecting some of the symptoms of depersonalization and derealization. You know, perhaps the reason liminal spaces are so terrifying is because the lack of people implies a traumatic event just beforehand, one we can't seem to identify through the ambiguity. Perhaps Paratopic is so effective because we're given no clear answer on who we are and what we're doing outside of the obvious. Apart from that, we seem to be caught in the middle of a crisis that was either already happening or has already occurred. Perhaps these games are so terrifying because they encapsulate a brutal reality many of us have been through. Trauma response. An experience and a journey that is destructive. When I was younger, I had an older family member in a position of familial authority abuse me. It's not something I talk about often. In fact, this is one of the first times outside of within my own family that I have. It wasn't really an active decision though, I simply forgot. Or I thought I forgot, more accurately. People in my family would sometimes bring it up to me and I would just tell them I couldn't remember anything, but I think I've realized that was never true. I didn't remember everything, God no, again, I was young. But I did remember some things, small, hyper-specific details. The food I was eating a few minutes beforehand, the way the lights in the room looked, the way the garden of their house was, the grass flattened in the places my feet would stomp as I ran around it, the feel of the metal chains of the swing set, the squeak of the rust. Those are the things I remember. Sometimes I wander those places, those memories in my dreams, and they start out warm, because I had fun running around that garden. I had fun on that swing set. But all those things are surrounded by a blur now, a fog, and then the dread bleeds in. And so comes the sounds I don't want to remember, words I don't want to hear spoken again. I'm nostalgic, I dream of the safety and the childhood fun that garden once meant to me, and yet it feels off, because I know what that went on to become after. Throughout my entire childhood, and even sometimes now, I've been terrified of people in positions of authority, teachers, my parents, basically any adults older than me. None of these people had ever given me a reason to fear them or to assume they could harm me, and yet because of that one family member, I grew up in abject terror of being one mistake, one instance of not behaving the way they wanted me to, away from the same treatment. I kept to myself, I worked hard, and that's good, but I feel like I spent so much of my childhood walking on eggshells as a result of one person's actions, and that because of it, I never knew a state that wasn't some form of anxiety after that. Combine that with masking at the time undiagnosed autism and a host of other issues, and you get a lost boy who can never seem to set his head free. I didn't really ever come to terms or acknowledge what happened to me until in the last few years. I still don't talk about it with people, but internally I've accepted that those actions were not the fault of mine. I'm really lucky that my parents have always been wonderful and supportive and removed that person from my life as soon as they discovered what was going on. But I lost a lot of other family members because, as so many abusers do, they claimed I was making the whole thing up, and I essentially lost half my family to that. So much of my life was spent in denial because of it too, like what if somehow I had made it up? I can't and refuse to remember the specifics, so what if they never happened? The ambiguity of my own trauma was scary. There's research to suggest that childhood trauma can cause post-traumatic stress, a primary symptom of which is re-experiencing, specifically in the form of nightmares. Re-experiencing, according to the NHS, is when a person involuntarily and vividly relives a traumatic event. Towards the end of Skinamarink, and this is spoiler territory now, so be warned, the audience sees what we can only perceive to be the titular Skinamarink killing the main character Kevin repeatedly, resetting him back to life just to make him relive his moment of death over and over again. This is interesting in terms of the medium of video games. You die in the game, you relive, re-experience that section over and over again until you survive it. What's interesting too is that you could probably suggest that the remakes that dominate the modern horror landscape within gaming act as a form of re-experiencing, though this isn't really something I've delved into any further in my research. Re-experiencing can often appear to lack a time perspective and a context, according to Anke Eller's study on the subject. And so we're back at ambiguity, the timeless feeling of liminal space hallways, the lack of context to their absence of life, the out-of-time nature of designing modern video games with the aesthetic of those of the past, the context you miss in the blurry, low-poly graphics and the fast-paced scares that make your chest tighten and your brain panic too quickly to think. The way these games, obscured by their own aesthetic choices and the ambiguity they propose, and even Skinamarink's oblique style of filming by implication, give players and watchers the minimal context clues necessary to make out what's going on at any given time, leaves each individual to come up with the scariest possible answer for themselves, often stemming from their own traumas and fears because of the similarity between this ambiguity and the ambiguity of re-experiencing. I've talked about a lot in this video: nostalgia, loneliness, memory, liminality, dreams, nightmares, depersonalization, derealization, trauma, trauma response, and re-experiencing. So let me bring it all together for a moment. When games use nostalgia to scare you, they draw on your own fears and experiences to make each player's experience personal. The use of nostalgic graphics and styles aims to place you somewhere dreamlike, sometimes nightmare-like, as though you're experiencing corrupted memories, experiences that feel familiar and yet off. Because these aren't your memories, of course, they're just drawing on them, forcing you to observe them from a distance, to re-experience your memories of older games and the experiences that surrounded them, your memories of childhood joy and the reality of the absence of it from your life now, your childhood fears and the reminder that they're still there, somewhere, deep down, waiting. I've talked about Skinamarink a lot in this video too, and I could say so much more. In fact, originally I had a script double the length of this one, diving deeper and further into the labyrinth of impact the film had on me. But I wanted this video to be about horror games. Still, Skinamarink is important to me because I'm not scared by horror movies. It's why I've always turned to horror games for a good scare. The lack of interactivity to the films means I find them entertaining, sure, but I'm never really scared. Or rather, was never really scared. Skinamarink was the first to ever make me feel that with a film. I couldn't sleep for days on end. I started seeing things in the corners of darkness within my own room. Nostalgia can be scary, because it dangles the idea of safer times in front of you. You know, your childhood memories when life was simpler and less stressful. And yet it allows the dread of knowing what comes after, the hardships of your life, to seep in behind you while you're not looking. When games use nostalgia to scare you, they become all the scarier. Thank you so much for watching this video. I want to add on to the end here that I didn't go into much detail on modern horror remakes, but I do have some things to say. For example, I think the interesting thing about them is that most of them are built from the ground up again. Take Resident Evil 4's remake, for example. It's fundamentally familiar if you've played the original, but it's also an entirely new experience. It's like the concept of nostalgia itself. You feel safe because you've been here before, and yet something is off. It's different now. I'd also like to add that in researching for this video, I discovered an indie developer here on YouTube creating this game, Daydream. I don't know much about it, but I found the footage shown off in this video really interesting, so I've linked it down below if you're interested in checking it out. If you like this video, please do consider sticking around and let me know down below what you think about the video. If there's any horror games that you think use nostalgia to scare the player, I'd love to know about them. I'm trying to play more indie games at the moment and just generally different experiences.
Is this future, bro? Is this past? You are in. Now there is no place to go. No.